The Solomon Islands government has confirmed it's in the process of negotiating a security agreement with China. News broke last night that a draft proposal was in the works, a deal that could see Chinese troops and naval warships based in the Solomon Islands. Now, Labor says it's a major foreign policy blunder, but Peter Dutton denies Australia had dropped the ball in the Pacific. The Prime Minister hasn't spoken with his counterpart there, but says they'll deal with the issue as they would with family.
We are the single largest provider of development assistance into the Pacific. Daylight second, daylight third. And through the course of the pandemic in particular, that has been our first and primary focus beyond our own shores. We have led in the Pacific, but I think events that you've seen most recently, I think only highlight the constant pressure and the constant push that is coming into the region from interests that are not aligned with Australia's and not aligned with those of the Pacific more broadly.
Now, late today, the Solomon Islands government was not backing down, saying Solomon Islands is working to broaden its security and development cooperation with more countries. The approach taken by the country is in line with its 2020 national security strategy and the country's foreign policy of friends to all, enemies to none. And to tell us more about what this draft deal means, we're joined by Pacific analyst and project lead for the Pacific Hub at Griffith University's Griffith Asia Institute, Tess Newton Cain. Welcome to The Drum.
Thank you.
Now, the government was very defensive today, as we've just heard, about our work and our support in the Pacific. Peter Dutton said we have a fantastic relationship with the Solomon Islands, and the Prime Minister says we're like a family. Is that true?
I think the Prime Minister's right to point to Australia's primacy in terms of relationships with countries such as Solomon Islands. And I think it's worth remembering that Australia already has a security treaty with Solomon Islands that was signed in 2018. So Australia is a very prominent player in the security environment when it comes to the region, and in particular in relation to Solomon Islands. Last year, when there was unrest in Honiara, it was to Australia, among others, that Prime Minister Sogavare turned for assistance with security to bring that situation under control. And he was at pains to say then that Australia was Solomon Islands' best friend. I guess what we've seen over the last 24 hours or so is a demonstration of what shouldn't come as a surprise, which is Solomon Islands has more than one friend.
But surely it means, I mean, there's going to be a conflict because, that's not, Australia would not see that in their interest. Is it the case that we're no longer the foreign partner of choice?
Well, I think it's unrealistic and naive to think that this is a zero-sum game. As we heard from the Solomon Islands government earlier today, this is part of their foreign policy, which, like a lot of Pacific Island countries, is based on being friends to all and enemies to none. As with a number of Pacific Island countries, Solomon Islands has made it clear that it sees this particular geopolitical moment as one in which it has more choices than might have been available previously. It has a range of interests and objectives that it wants to pursue, and it sees that there are multiple conversations to have. I think that's part of the environment in which Australia finds itself. Now, the security of the region is of importance to everybody, not just Australia. How that security is framed and perceived can vary depending on who you talk to. For a number of people in the Pacific, issues around climate change and the impacts of climate change are much more important than potential military ambitions on the part of China. I think in terms of Australia's friendship with Solomon Islands and Australia's continuing conversation, it has the basis of an existing security treaty. There's no question, according to Solomon Islands, there's no reason to think that if they have an agreement with China, that somehow negates the one with Australia. Their position seems to be we can have multiple versions of this sort of agreement. So Australia, nobody's knocked Australia out, nobody's locking Australia out of the room, nobody's closing down any conversations. And Australia needs to think, I think Australia needs to think about what the opportunity is here for them to really demonstrate true faith in this friendship with Solomon Islands.
And the question is how we do that. Katan, do we need to be talking about climate change here?
Yes, definitely. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is that clip of Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison and Tony Abbott all standing at a forum. The two of them, Peter Dutton and Tony Abbott, not realising that a boom mic above their heads was active. Tony Abbott and Peter Dutton are joking about, making pretty racist jokes about Pacific Islands people and saying that they're going to have water lapping at their door, and Scott Morrison kind of quietly nudges them and says, "There's a boom mic up there." And it was quite a horrible moment, right? Like it's sort of, it just laid out, I guess, the feelings about this issue. Like it was like a really sort of, it sort of went right down into them, not their policies, but how they felt about it. And that really stuck with me. And then, of course, at many subsequent climate meetings, the sort of annual climate meeting, the Conference of Parties, Australia has been something of a laggard or a blocker of climate policy, whereas when you hear the speeches and messages from Pacific Islands people there, they're pleading, right from the heart, they're pleading really intensely and emotionally, please, 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 first of all, help us with money. We need money to help deal with the locked-in impacts already there. And we also need you to reduce your emissions and stop making the problem worse, because they're vulnerable in a way that I think many of us in Australia have trouble imagining or understanding. So, of course, we have to be talking about this. And I guess one interesting complication here, of course, is that China has very high emissions, as does Australia. Both countries have a high carbon footprint in two different ways. So I guess there's an element in terms of relationships between nations. It's complicated, but that doesn't make it any less important to talk about climate change here.
So action on climate change in that sense could be a form of soft power, which is an opportunity lost. Tess, where to now for the government? You're saying that don't worry, we still have our own security treaty with them, and that's already existing, and we shouldn't underestimate their own autonomy. And in fact, the question is not perhaps what's best for Australia, but what's best for the Solomon Islands and the entire region. So how do you think Australia should be approaching these negotiations now, given the potential or perceived threat?
Well, I think my colleague, Dr. Anna Pauls in New Zealand, often makes the very valid point that when it comes to working in the Pacific, relationships are currency. And I think that really Australia needs to think about how it develops and sustains relationships with interlocutors and counterparts in Solomon Islands, and what the basis of those relationships are. Now, when it comes to something like security, trust is a really key issue here. And historically, conversations around hard security issues, as well as other security issues, have indicated and demonstrated that often Pacific Island partners feel that there is a lack of trust on the part of their Australian counterparts. They feel that they're not necessarily given all the information, or they're kept out of key conversations. I think it's really important at this juncture that all who are involved, whether they are on the ground in Honiara or elsewhere, need to demonstrate as far as possible that this relationship between Australia and Solomon Islands is one based on trust, until such point as that's not able to be sustained. We're not at that point at this stage. I think it's really important that we remember that the primary, if we look at what Solomon Islands is saying and the relationships that Solomon Islands is establishing, we need to be confident and we need to be honest about the fact that Australia is actually listening to what is being said in Solomon Islands, not necessarily just by one or two people, but across the board as to what their concerns are and how Australia can meet them, if at all, and be prepared to have quite sort of robust and honest conversations about these things.
And just quickly, Sam, the government has been talking for some time. The Prime Minister, Peter Dutton, saying we are the ones who can handle the security. We are the ones best suited to deal with China. On the opposite side of the chamber is the Manchurian candidate. Where does this leave them when we now have a potential base, 2,000 kilometres away?
Well, it's a big worry given that the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has made a big song and dance about being a friend of the Pacific and taking a particular interest in this if this has kind of happened under his nose. I don't agree with the idea that Solomon Islands can be a friend to everyone and enemy to none. I mean, you know, who else are they going to do deals with? Russia? I mean, I do think that it is a significant change to the organising principles that have been laid down in the region for quite a while. And I think you can understand why the government can be concerned about. I'm not convinced it's purely about climate change. I take your point about the soft power argument, and I think there has been a lot of anger in the Pacific about positions Australia has adopted. But at the end of the day, China is hardly some sort of paragon of green left environmental virtues. So at the end of the day, this is about money. And that's what Australia's probably going to have to look at to put in to address that.
Okay. Tess Newton, thanks for joining the drama this evening. Thanks so much for your expertise. Tess Newton Cain.